Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our study today. We are in the book of Judges. Hooray! It is one of my favorite books of the Hebrew Bible. And as you can see on the screen here, as we're sharing in Hebrew, the book of Judges is really called Shophetim. Shophetim is the plural of a shofet. A shofet, of course, in Hebrew, was translated into judges in English. But unfortunately, in 21st century English, our impression of what a judge is does not come close to matching what a shofet was back in the time when the book of Judges or the book of Shophetim was written. Back then, this person was a defender, a deliverer. He wasn't somebody sitting behind a desk with a gavel, slamming it and pronouncing judgment. He was someone, while they did defending and delivering, judgment was met out through the avenging and punishing. So it encompassed a whole lot more than what a judge does today. And so I was happy to find that embellished explanation so that my thought process wasn't so narrow on these people that we're going to meet in the book of Judges that try to break the mindset of what I know today in our 21st century Midwestern United States lifestyle uh, does not relate to what they did. They were often mostly called by God, that these were people who God's presence came over and their hearts were stirred and they became a useful vessel that God used for specific occasions. And so we're going to get to meet many of them, and you'll find that they are incredibly unique individuals that even if I had the craziest science fiction mind and was a fiction writer, I don't think I could come up with the stories the way we're going to have here today as we study the book of Judges. What's interesting is, right now we open our Bible and we find everything all bound together with nice leather and binding and put in an order that has come to be known as the canon, C-O. N-O-A, I think it is, O-N, canon, C-A-N-O-N, excuse me. But it wasn't that way. There are ancient manuscripts that lump together Joshua, Judges, and the book of Ruth all together because, as we know, Joshua flowed into Judges. The book of Ruth occurred about the same time frame as the Judges were being um, compiled. The writer for the book of Judges is anonymous. It's traditionally held that Samuel wrote it, although the whole time frame for the book of Judges covers well over 400 years. And so Samuel, his life was at the time of King David, King Saul. So he was at the end of that 400 years. So again, not sure just how it was created, but we do see that it has some fantastic stories in it. Unfortunately, it's a very tragic uh, ending to this. We see that the tribes lose their sense of unity and yield to the seductions, is how the commentator put it, of nature worship and forget the one true God. What we will be coming back to over and over again is this map. This map is fantastic that I found it, and it shows the land of Israel during the time of the judges, and every little square box, white box with red letters in, is one of the judges that we're going to read about over this 410-year history. Some are very close together, some are simultaneous, but you see that they're spread all over the map, if you will, and very, very interesting individuals. So today we're going to be starting with the opening of the book of Judges, and it's going to center around what I'm circling with my cursor down in the lower left-hand corner. You see the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Simeon. You see the land of, the city of Jerusalem, and you see the city of Hebron and of Deber. And so, with that little bit of introduction, we go into our story. And so, remembering this is just a continuation, just another narration and another compiler of the stories. And it says, after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first to fight against them? This is kind of interesting because this is something that was lacking, I thought, in the book of Joshua, is the inquiry of the people asking God, what shall we do next? And so I thought this sets just a beautiful stage saying, okay, everybody's on the right track. They listen to the admonition of Joshua. They're invoking the Lord. They're asking for direction. This is all good. This is all what you'd want to see. The other thing it tells us is that they were not at rest or at peace, which is what we kind of understood from the close of the book of Joshua, that, the land was conquered, everybody settled in, God gave them peace, everything is just wonderful and going to be smooth sailing. Well, we find that there was still seemingly a lot of work to do. And so the this admonition went forth, and so they asked God, who should go forward? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up, for I have delivered the land into his hand. This is where it should have just said, okay, Judah went, and let's read this story about how Judah goes and conquers. But no, we don't get that. We see a deviation right away in verse 3, that Judah doesn't just respond and go and do what God told him to do. He goes and gets his brother Simeon and says, come up with me and help me that we can fight against the Canaanites, and then I'll go with you. Um, Again, this is, I think, to me, it's a deviation from what God wanted them to do. Um, why did this happen? What brought this about? Let's go back and take a look at the map. Looking down here in this lower left-hand corner, we see the tribe of Judah encompassing a huge area with hardly any cities in it. This is obviously where the Canaanites were. And who is smack dab in the middle of Judah but the tribe of Simeon? I thought this was kind of interesting. Where did these borders get formed, and why is Simeon right in the middle, surrounded by by his brother Judah? And as I'm researching this, I find something very interesting, is that obviously these are all brothers. All the tribes came from Israel, but they didn't all come from the same mother. There were four women who bore children to Jacob, and one was his first wife, which was Leah, and the second wife was Rachel, and then they had two concubines, or two handmaidens of each one. So there were four women that bore children to Jacob. But in this case, Simeon and Judah had the same mother and the same father. They both came from Leah. And so you can imagine that they were very close. And Judah was always kind of the big brother to Simeon. And so it's no surprise that they are in the middle of this. Just an interesting thought. And so Simeon and Judah linked forces, but yet it still shows that God's favor was upon them. He didn't say, oh, wait a minute, you messed up. You didn't follow every direction to the letter, you're toast. We find here in verse 4 that the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they slew them in Bezek, 10,000 men. Now, we don't know much about the Perizzites. They're mentioned here, but there's no history that we can find, not much record of them. We find the Canaanites being people that show up over and over again. They seem to be greater in number. But what's interesting here is the time it took and the inclusion of this people of Bezek, that 10,000 men were slain. And then during this time, they come to a guy named Adonai Bezek, which is a compound word. You may recognize the word Adonai is Hebrew for Lord, and Bezek is who he's lord over. So this is the king or the lord over Bezek. And so they fought against him, and it said they slew those guys. I always get intrigued when I see these names because the names normally have a meaning behind them. They don't necessarily mean this is what their mother and father named them, but it's a descriptor. And so I went to a Aramaic Hebrew lexicon, which is like a dictionary, and looked up the word Bezek, and it's spelled here Beit Zion Kuf, and it means to cast or to shoot a mass of fragments like from a catapult. There's a root word that means it is spreading flashes of light. So the indication here that this Adonai Bezek, or the king of Bezek, had some weapons at his hand. We know from some of the places we read in the scriptures that the Israelites come across enemies who had, they call them engines. And again, we don't have any idea what they were, but we know they used catapults. And so it's conceivable that Adonai Bezek was the lord of the catapults, the lord of shooting massive fragments. And because they flashed, it's conceivable that he could have taken what was common. They took tar and pitch and made, like napalm bombs out of it, where they light this on fire and throw it in a catapult, and it, goes over their enemy, and has pieces of shrapnel in it, plus burning fire that would help to destroy them. So this was a bad guy. He had some strong weaponry, knowing that the Israelites did not have any of that. The Israelites were forbidden to use horses by God. They were forbidden to use chariots by God. They had to use bows and arrows, and they used swords and spears. And so they were commanded by God to keep a very simple military. This commandment was broken by the hand of King Solomon, who went and built up chariots and large armies with horsemen. And so again, that was part of his downfall. But prior to this, Israel was forbidden because they needed to rely on God. And so they were not allowed to use all the sophisticated weaponry that some of the others had. So this was a big thing. Putting this little inclusion in here shows that God had allowed a much weaker army and a less outfitted army to conquer over someone who had greater military might and power. Kind of reminds you of what's going on in um, over in Ukraine today against Russia. Some similarities there. So this guy he's running. Adonai Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him. And now it even gets stranger. And it says, as they captured him, they cut off his thumbs and great toes. The thought of Israel practicing mutilation is not anywhere found in the scriptures. It is obviously not something how God wanted them to behave, but here we see the influence of how the Canaanite kings behaved, because obviously those pagan Canaanite kings, they had no rules. There was no rules of warfare. There was no Geneva Convention. That they did horrible, terrible things to those that they conquered. And Adonai Bezek confesses. He says, I caught 70, which I believe is 70 kings, means he conquered 70 nations. And what he did to them was he cut their thumbs off and their big toes off, and he let them grovel underneath his table for anything they could eat. This was not a banquet table where they were invited. This was torture, meaning that they starved to death and could only eat scraps, and he seemed to enjoy watching them die of starvation during part of this torture. And so he says, now this is being done to me. So the Israelites obviously knew that this was how he behaved, and they responded kind of like poetic justice. Okay, we caught you, we're going to do to you what you've done to all these others, because obviously this was a fearful thing. It's one thing to be killed, it's another thing to be tortured and mutilated. And so it doesn't say that God responded in any way to them doing this, either favorably or unfavorably, but we see through the scriptures that this was not really what God wanted them to do. And here we find something interesting that Adonai Bezek confesses at the end. He says, "As I have done, so God hath requited me." Now, this is not Adonai Bezek suddenly converting to serve the one true God and having any repentance. This was the terminology of the land, because the word here that is used for God is Elohim, which is not Yahweh. So this is a term used for God in general, meaning all the pagan gods were called Elohim through all the pagan nations. So he's not favorably serving or turning to God. He's just saying that basically this is a twist of fate or karma. This is the equivalent of what he's saying here. This is just, this is because I've done this, so the gods are requiring that I suffer in this same way, kind of living by the sword and dying by the sword. And it said they brought him to Jerusalem and he died there. So let's go back at our map and look at where Jerusalem is. Okay, here is the land of Judah. It borders Jerusalem. Jerusalem is in the land of Benjamin, but obviously has not been conquered yet. And the reason for this is the land of Jerusalem doesn't get conquered finally until David conquers it. So it's taken, it looks here in verse 8 that, excuse me, verse 7, that Adonai Bezek died there. Now, whether he died from his wounds, whether he died of other circumstances, we don't know, but he didn't have a long life. And so, verse 8, they fought against Jerusalem, they took it, and they just pretty much burned it to the ground and decimated it. And they did not rebuild it, they did not inhabit it. And so we find that someone else later comes in and rebuilds it, and at the time of King David, he goes and finally conquers the city, and then it becomes inhabited by the Israelites. So a little bit of history we're going to come across. So they went and fought in verse 9, and then they get to verse 10. And this is an interesting part here that says Judah went against the Canaanites that dwelt in Hebron. Now we'll look back at the map, see where Hebron was. That's right here where I'm circling with the cursor. It's actually closer to the land of Simeon and quite a bit south of Jerusalem. So obviously occupying the land, there was still a lot to conquer. So they went to Hebron, and this is a incredible place that we wouldn't have known about except they include some names here. That the name beforehand was Kirjath Harba, and that name means it was an association with a league. Hebron means association with a league. So the name was changed as it goes through here. And so it was a city of giants. And that is what Kirja Arba means. Arba means four, and Kirja means it was a city of giants. And if we look here, these names of Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai are the names of the children, the descendants of Anak that were there. And this was referenced, you see in blue letters in Numbers, the book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 22, and that this was mentioned during the time that the spies were sent into the promised land to conquer it, that they came to the city of Hebron. And who do they say but Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai? They saw the giants there, and this frightened the spies, and was one of the reasons that they brought back this evil report, and that they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. So it's no coincidence that Judah went back to this city, took care of business, and slew these giants, and took the fear out of them in this land. Now, you can find out that somebody escaped. One of the descendants of Anak escaped, and we're going to come across him later as being Goliath. So one of the ancestors of these guys escaped and became Goliath that David fought against. And so finally, to close out in this area here, we're gonna stop with verse 10 and pick up again next week. But I hope you enjoy this little story. Fantastic implications here about how the battle is going and how the children of Israel were used. God used them to slay and fight against people who are much better equipped and still give them the victory. So pray that you all have a wonderful week. God bless you, and we'll see you again next week. Bye bye.